Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss and internet shitlords, and as you can see, I got Meatball over here. She's making noises. And today I'm going to be doing a bit of discussion on game design mostly, but it's also DMing and it's also about how you play the game. So we'll see if you like this. It's not going to be a video where I'm courting a lot of controversy, except for people who have strong opinions about gameplay and game design. but yeah. So, anyways, if you're just showing up for the first time here, then be sure to check out all of my videos and subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoy them. And if not, if you're already a loyal member of the Shitlord Army, then please continue to share these videos anywhere you think people find them interesting or be pissed off by them. And if you want to support me, check out my products. I technically have a Patreon page, but I don't do anything with it. So, if you really don't want to buy any of my books for some weird reason, or you've bought all of my books for a completely sensible reason, then you can always support me on Patreon by just giving me some money for fighting the good fight and continuing to stand up to the elements of the woke culture in the gaming community. But the best way to do that really is to pick up my books. Don't buy books by people who hate you. Like just the other day, the guy that publishes Delta Green has basically done a post with this festooned multi-rainbow flag saying that if you disagree with my politics, then I don't want you to buy my products. So you should say, okay, yeah, I won't buy your products. Buy something better instead, like the Invisible College, which is way cooler than Delta Green. Because let's face it, Cthulhu is overdone, and you can get way more interesting stuff from this 432-page book that is full of influences that aren't Lovecraftian, but rather come from real world historical occultism and things like that. And you get to play secret agents if you want to, and you've got all kinds of cool modern gaming in the OSR style. So then there's Lion and Dragon, the Old School Companion. Old School Companion has tons of excellent supplements that you can add into any D&D or OSR campaign. And check out all my other products too. You get a full description, a full link, a set of links in the description below to this video. And you're bound to find something that you're going to enjoy playing. And check it out. Check out the RPG Pundit Presents series especially. It's got like 108 issues that are all PDF format, ranging from $1 to $4.99. And, so it's like less than the price of a coffee these days mostly. And you get something that you can actually play, and you're bound to find something you like out of all of those products. All right, so today what I am talking about is the kind of meta theory behind how I think you need to look at character creation mainly. Because there is this, I had this discussion with somebody on Twitter talking about how they're using a system where, you have to select feats when you pick your advantages and disadvantages when you create a character. And that's perfectly fine, right? That doesn't bother him at all, and it gets done really fast. And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, but you're like one of the guys that helped design this thing, and if you've got a newbie on there and they look at that, so for purely pragmatic reasons, for start with, then they have to look through this whole long list of advantages and disadvantages and try to figure out which one is going to give them either the character they want or the best benefit and the least bad side for the disadvantage that they can possibly get. So they're going to have to study this. And if they don't study this, then the player character who has meticulously studied it will get an advantage over the other one. I've made this argument before. So, that's par for the course. But then there's also the question of should you even be picking feats? Okay. And let me explain what I mean. So what are the two core essences of the RPG experience? One is emulation and the other one's immersion, right? So emulation is to create a world, to create a virtual but real feeling world, not a setting for a movie or a TV show, not a world that only exists where the PCs are and nowhere else, right? It has to be a world that is absolutely alive and feels real. Okay, that's step one. Step two is immersion. And in immersion, what you need to have is that you have a character that this is for the player now. The player is playing a character, and that character is something different from themselves that over time, as they play, because at first it's just them pretending to be the character, but then after a while, as if that character is engaged with enough, and if the world is real enough, the character starts to come to life in the world, and it starts to be a different person aside from the player. It's not the player is no longer pretending to be that character. That character is a separate consciousness inside of the player that will make decisions spontaneously, right? So the moment you know that you're in a state of immersion is when you're playing a character in an RPG, and the character suddenly comes up with an idea. You didn't do it. You didn't think it through. You didn't come up with the idea. You did not expect that to be what the character would do, but then suddenly it pops up, and okay, yeah, this is exactly what this character would do, not what I would do. It's what this character would do, and then you do it, right? And then you start to get surprised that the character itself has now a life of its own. Okay, so those are the bigger goals. So now, how in character creation and in play can you encourage those two bigger goals? And I think that there's the tricky part here is that there's two different tracks. One is the play experience, because partly this is a game, right? This is not an exercise in like astral travel or something like that. Like you're not making this world and inhabiting it just for its own sake. You're doing it because you want to engage in an entertaining virtual experience, right? It's not just a normal, it's not, it's like when Bart Simpson gets the golf video game instead, the putting green game or whatever, instead of the game that, the head chopper game that he wanted to get, it's that sort of, you're not creating a game just for the sake of the game being there without it actually being fun, right? So fun has to be a very important consideration. The other side of it is this element of being able to encourage emulation, and to encourage emulation by having parts of the character creation process reflect a true virtual world, okay? So when we make a character, there are lots of ways that you could do that, right? One is you could do it with a bunch of random rolls, right? Which is the standard way to do it in, Dungeons and Dragons and most OSR games. At least up to the end of second edition. Another way could be to meticulously point buy everything with a whole bunch of points, and you purchase things and you pre-plan. You get to control. So in one of those, you control very little about what that character looks like at the beginning. In the other one, you control everything that the character looks like, at least within the limits of what the point buy options allow you to do. So I would argue that the random version is better than the point buy version in terms of that goal of creating the emulative experience. Because you want to have the character not be something that is just chosen as an extension of self, or as, that you have complete design control over it, because you don't have control, for example, of the conditions of your birth, right? So what you want to have is that the character, for it to feel real and for the world to feel real, the character can't come out of a position where you as the player, as let's say the spirit of this character, got to decide everything that happened to him, right? Like everything that was formative to it, right? So it is more emulative if all the things that you don't really get to pick about in life, you also don't get to pick about in character creation, okay? So, what I mean is, let's say you are born in a world, right? So first thing, your physical and mental attributes. You don't get to decide what those are, right? You get to decide later on maybe what you study, maybe, because I'll get into that in a second, right? But you don't get to decide how strong you are potentially able to be, right? Or how intelligent you get to be, right? Like you can later decide how hard you work or how hard you study, but you don't get to decide these things that are basically a question of chance of birth. You don't get to decide what social class you come from, right? So you always see these characters, and this is part of the reason why the whole big backstory thing is anti-emulative and it's dangerous, right? So when in a lot of modern day games, particularly because the players know that there's a good chance the campaign itself won't last very long because long campaigns are apparently hard in new school type games. They come up with 12 pages of backstory that they want to force into the setting, and then they are becoming like co-authors of the setting if you let them, and if you don't, you're a monster, right? So there's this whole conflict that emerges. So with that kind of backstory, what it does is it ends up imposing this reality into the setting that is anti-emulative, right? Because the player shouldn't get to decide any of these things. So if you look at Lion and Dragon, you roll randomly for your social class, right? You might be a peasant, you might be a duke, or the son of a duke at least. You roll randomly for the background of that social class, right? So instead of having a 12-page backstory, what you do is you roll, and so it takes literally, I think, 2 rolls, maybe 3, and if there's a subtable, and it tells you, well, this is what your character did before he became, a level 0 adventurer. So it could be any number of things. There's lots, in the basic Lion and Dragon, there's lots of options. The old school companion, there's I don't know if are the expanded advancement tables in there, or the expanded prior history tables aren't available there. They're available in an RPG Pundit Presents. But anyways, so there's you could get a couple of tables or a lot of tables that give you a whole bunch of different options for potential backstories, but you don't get to pick it. You roll it, right? And then you end up deciding your class, because that's where you can do it. But of course, there are restrictions based on the ability scores, right? So if you have less than 9 strength, you're not going to be a warrior. You might wish you could be, but you can't be. Sorry, right? So you get to pick certain things, which are the things that you are involved in yourself, and even those could be kind of like. You could make an argument that you could roll a character and actually the player character has 0 choice about anything, right? Maybe not even what class he is, that's even possible. Because there's a lot of this stuff that might seem like, first of all, because a lot of the stuff that we do might seem like our free choice, but is actually a product of either our circumstances or, more often than not, our internal kind of programming, let's say our impulses, our deeply primordial impulses. And we know this nowadays, that a lot of the things that we do, unless you work very hard to overcome this, a lot of the things that we do, we end up doing out of these primordial instincts. We make a decision, we start to do the thing, and only after we've started to do the thing do we think up a more elaborate and less embarrassing sounding motivation than, caveman want, right? And then we apply that motivation and we convince our own brains that we had thought that through before we made the choice, and that was why we made the choice, right? So most of the times we're not really choosing things. We're just doing things on impulse, and then later on justifying that, saying we went through a rational process to do it, It doesn't have to be that way, but unless you're going out of your way to be very conscious, it often is, right? So there's a total justification in saying, well, you know what? Everything's rolled. So you start with a character that's extremely random. Now, I don't go quite that far in Lion and Dragon. There are a few things also, because, again, of fun and playability, that you end up wanting to give some element of choice, right? So if you've got more than one option of what class you could be based on your ability scores, you should probably get to pick that, right? In Invisible College, which is a modern setting book, I also include, so in your background, you have a social class and you have a class background. And then, the class background has a list of different possible skills that could be generated from that for the creation of the character. And I let the player pick out of those skills which ones he wants, right? So, but it's not a list of here's 50 skills, you have 17 points, you're going to have to spend them in these 50 skills, go nuts for the next hour and a half trying to figure out what's your min-maxing potential, right? It's like, here's 6 skills, you get 3 of them, pick the 3, that's it. Like, that's the way that it has to be done, right? Because we're also talking about here this question of what is more practical for gaming purposes, right? So that's that's a kind of a compromise, but the compromise should always be strongly in favor of saying, like, the things that we must allow the player character are those things that should be the most clearly and evidentially choices that the character could make. Technically, before he starts actually playing, it could be arguable that the player shouldn't have any choice necessarily over what the character looks like when he's being created, right, before we start the game. But in practical terms, if you're going to give choices, then the priority of choices should be for those things that the character himself at the time would have had some ability to choose. Feats are usually not that, right? Because most of the times feats or advantages or disadvantages are in fact characteristics of life in some way or another, right? So like, an advantage could be keen-eyed, right? And a disadvantage could be colorblind. Neither of those are things you train for or decide, right? So this is another reason why this is not a good selection choice, right? Like, this is something that if you really want to have characters having advantages and disadvantages, and in certain ways, like for example, in Lion and Dragon, I kind of do in the context of the prior background table, because that's totally random, right? And so you might get a background that says, oh, you had an affair with a wealthy dowager and she's given you a ton of money. Or you might have another one that says, you were exiled from your homeland, and if you try to go back, someone will kill you, right? Like that, it's luck of the draw, right? So if you want to have random advantage to disadvantage tables, that's one thing, right? But on a level of the verisimilitude, on the level of emulation, anything that very clearly is not a question of choice, you should look at it as a designer if you're designing the game, as a DM if you're running the game, and say, well, is there a really, really, really good reason why the player should have a choice here, or should it be random? Because if there's not a really good reason, it should be random. On the other hand, for things that the character himself would have had a chance to decide, then you can say, well, is there a really good reason why this shouldn't be a choice? Right. And usually the only good reason why it shouldn't be a choice would be playability. Right. So like, if it makes the character creation process significantly longer. Right. One of the things about Lion and Dragon is that as long as the person kind of guiding the character process is skilled, it takes almost no time to create a starting level character, because it's almost all rolls. You roll, you even have a table of names, so you don't even have to stop to figure out what your name is, right? You can roll all of that up. Now, of course, you could theoretically pick a name or something like that, but like literally the only parts that the player chooses in the process is which class he's going to be, and his like physical appearance and gender, right? That's it. That's basically the only things that he chooses when he's creating the character, because ability scores are random, equipment is predetermined, background skills are random, all the character starting conditions are randomly generated or just assigned. Those are the only things he picks. He picks his alignment, I guess, too. Yeah. But yeah, so that is a fast way of doing things, and fast is good for character creation as a rule. But there might be a reason why some of these elements that you might want to give an option to, for one reason or another, and then you could go ahead and do that. But the point is, you want to think about these things, because the in the playing of it, right? Like there's a complete difference between the character pre-designed and the character once actual play starts to happen. And that's why backstory never is a substitute for actually playing through the character. That's the reason, the biggest reason why 12-page backstories for, starting level characters are dumb is not just because they're really annoying to the DM and because usually they're garbage and stuff like that. Usually it's just an excuse for a Mary Sue, or because it's the player trying to be an author of the world, which they should not be. But it's also because it just doesn't work. It doesn't make the effect that it's supposed to make, because the character's past existence is something that has happened completely through this automatic process. And the only other thing you can add to it would be artificial process, right? So if the character, the whole point is you're playing the character. You're not playing the character when you're writing a backstory. So you're basically inventing a fantasy about the character, which is different. That's literature. It's not history. RPGs are not history, are not literature. They're history. You're playing through a character's life, right? You're not telling a story about the character. So this is where so many people get it wrong. Once you start playing the character, then you're living through the character, and the character is coming to life through you. And that's a completely different experience than you telling a story about a character that you don't actually know, because you are now living through the character and starting to know the character. Not entirely at first. It's very tentative at first. But if your character survives and you play him through long enough, then he begins to take on that life. Then you begin to have the process of immersion. And that's the entire goal. And there's anything that gets in the way of that immersion is counterproductive. So yeah, this was my video trying to explain some of the reasons why there are certain options that are better than others. In short, point buy or list selection, anything where you give too many choices is by default, not entirely, but by default, a less optimal idea than character creation with randomization for reasons of what the effects are you want to achieve. Right now, once you're actually playing the character, then of course the player should have absolute control over his character and his character's choices. And it doesn't really matter anymore, this question of the free will thing, because now you're playing, right? So as you're playing, that means you as the player are either operating as a rational actor or under the illusion of free will, acting on your impulses. And we can leave that to psychologists to decide, right? Because the important thing is now you're inside and you're acting the character, you're playing out the character. So we don't need to worry about that element of free will versus impulses, right? Or versus imprinting. Because you're going to live it out as the player playing the character. And once you've done that, then you can start to achieve immersion. But what you can't have is for the player in the game as the player to start being able to have influence over the rest of the world, because that shatters immersion immediately. Because suddenly your character has a power that that character isn't supposed to have. He isn't supposed to be able to by his will make the world different, right? Just without any effort, right? The way he makes the world different is by acting on it and in it, right? So this is again a reason why in play, any kind of mechanic that lets a player take control of the game world and change details of it or decide what's going to happen in the future before it happens. That's not in a way explained in world, right? I mean, I guess in theory you can have a magic item that can let you mold the future, right? But if you're not doing that in the world, if you're doing it at a meta level, that absolutely destroys the goals of what you're trying to achieve, right? So all of this is stuff to keep in mind if you're either designing a game or if you're running a game as a DM, to understand why there are actually better and worse ways to do this. So you've been taught wrong about D&D on purpose. That's the name of the playlist that I put all these videos under. And it's absolutely true, because one of the things you're taught wrong is, there's not really any good and bad in ways to DM or good and bad in ways to design a game. That's absolutely untrue. There are objectively better ways. Now, I'm not saying that that there's one way that's the one and only way, but that it's very clear that there are some methods that can be more conducive to easily achieving the goal of RPGs than other ways. I guess that's everything for today. Once again, if you like this video, please like it. Please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, share it everywhere, especially where they think there's anyone that might get pissed off about it. I guess there could be some theory wonks that'll get pissed off about it because if you've got fans of this kind of story point expenditure or making point buy characters. Just keep checking out my channel. Check out Inappropriate Characters. On the weekend, we had a bombshell of an episode, and we'll talk to you soon. Currently smoking a Stanwell Deluxe plus Argento Roots.